Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tip of the Week. This week I'm coming to you from Ottawa. Now I had a question on the forums this week about being able to do IK with Deform, and although it's not something that we can currently do, there is something else that we can do that is interesting when looking at how you can animate with Deform and stick the feet to the ground. So this week I'm going to talk about, how should I call this? Let's see. Let's just calling this swapping out deforms. So let me show you here on this simple example that I put together. You can see I have this really simple cutout character. It's a stick figure that's made up of different pieces that you can move around. When I rig this one, let me just show you how the basic rig works on this one. I have peg layers for each one of the drawings in here so that you can animate each one of the drawings independently. And then you can go up the hierarchy to this parent chain to rotate the two of them together. And I haven't really set up the pivot points on this character, so I'll just kind of do it as I go. But generally, you can move the arms together. And you go up the hierarchy again, and you can move the entire chest around together. So similarly, I've got the feet on their own separate layers. And then from there, you can go up the hierarchy to select the entire leg, and once again you can go up the hierarchy another time to move the hips as a whole layer. So I might just put the pivot point of the hips there in the center, and then of course you can move the master peg of the entire character. So what I thought was kind of an interesting thing to think about doing here, when you're animating with deforms, what happens is, I'll just show you on this first leg that I did here. Usually what you do when you're rigging the legs is you put the offset module, which is the top of the rig, you put it at the hip, and so you can animate very easily what's happening. In this case, this is a bone style deformer, so I can just move around the leg around that hip, and it works very well from the top down. But then what happens when you actually want to stick the feet to the ground? It's really difficult from a top-down rig to do this, as I'm sure you guys know already. Let me just take one of these frames later on here and try to do it for you. So, sorry, I've done a little bit of animation on this guy, a little bit, but let's just bring this back up here for a second. So let's say I want to stick this foot from the top-down rig, and I've got a keyframe here. I'll just make sure I set a keyframe on everything with F6, and I'll go a couple of frames later. And let's say I actually want him to squat. I want him to bend his knees. The way that I'd have to do it is I'd turn on my onion skin, and then I would make the character's legs bend, and then I would probably go back to the master peg, and I would move the master peg down so that it matches where the foot is there, and I would also animate, in this case, the foot, which, sorry, I haven't set the pivot points on this, so, okay. So in this case, I would just animate the position of the foot here to be stable. And even when you get that overlapping pretty well, because we use functions to define what happens between the two, you might get some of this bouncy action here, where if we look in very, very closely on what's happening at the foot level here, the first foot and the last foot are pretty similar in terms of their placement there, like they're pretty much right on top of each other. But in the frame in between, it's going down a little bit, like it's here, and then it goes down, and then it comes back up again to the same position. And that's because the way that the 3D path there is interpolating for the peg layer. One of the things that you can do, or you can try to do to see if it's going to help you, is instead of using 3D path on your pegs, like by default here, peg layers are created with 3D path. If you want to use a separate path instead, you can set that in your preferences, which is going to be in the general tab, and then default separate position for pegs. And that will help with that kind of thing a little bit. But the thing that would be really nice to do is to be able to actually just stick that foot where it is. And with the deform rig, we can do something that we can't do with the regular rigging that we do with Animate and Animate Pro. And that is, we can swap out and change the order of the hierarchy in a way. we can never swap out the order of the hierarchy as it appears in our network view. But the one that we can swap out is the actual deform one. So I'll just show you here. I did it on a couple of frames, and I'll show you how I did it. So on the second frame here, I set up a rig that's from the bottom down. So the offset module is on the bottom, and so I can leave the foot where it is, and then I can simply reposition the leg, and then I can animate the hip back up again. And what's nice about that is, although it takes a couple extra steps than the IK does, since that foot is quite literally not moving, you don't have that problem where it interpolates, where it goes down in between. So it's actually more easy to animate even though you're not animating all the pieces together. So in other words, let me just take this frame. I'm just going to copy what I have here, and I'll stick it somewhere else so that I can use it again. So let's say I've got this frame and I want to go a couple of frames later, and I want to actually have him bend his leg. So I can just bend the leg here, and I can rotate the hip down so that it sort of matches up with what's going on in my leg there. And I might have to finagle these guys around. I haven't rigged this leg yet. I'm going to do that with you guys, so that's why this leg is kind of hanging. But what I would do here is I would actually make this leg also sort of match what's going on. But what's nice is, do you see what's happening here when I actually look at the interpolation? That foot is stuck. It's just plain stuck because it's not moving. So there's no additional step that you need to do. Like when you're using the IK and Animate Pro, you can bend the whole character together, but then you have to go through this step afterwards where you have to kind of constrain the foot, and even apart from nailing the foot in place while you're moving things, you have to afterwards stick the foot out. And then what the IK tool does is it creates keyframe on every frame, calculating what the movement needs to be in order for that foot to be stuck. But here there's no calculation because the foot is quite literally not moving. So the way that you animate this is, instead of animating the entire character as one whole, you just animate that foot separately, and now I can go back and I can animate my chest separately. So that's the reason why I've set this character up so that the lower body is separate. I can move the entire lower body as one piece if I want to, but I can move just the hips on their own if I want to. And whenever I move the foot, the deform on the leg, the foot will come with it. So in other words, if I wanted to, I could still move this foot around, I could move the entire chain here, and the foot would come with it. But in this case, all I'm doing is I'm swapping to this one when I want to stick the foot. That's the only time I'm going to swap to this kind of a rig. So I can, in fact, do this kind of an animation extremely easily. Hopefully you guys can see how easy that is. I'm kind of ignoring the hierarchy that I put together before, but the animation is easier. The other type that I put together here just for fun was I did try to put a curve style deformer on the leg from the ground up instead of a bone style. So just showing this as another example of what you could do. Let's put one keyframe here, and then let's try to animate this. We'll go a few frames later, and I'll show you how you can actually just, like bend the leg down, let's say, like that. Now the only thing with the curve style deformer as opposed to the bone style deformer is that the curve style, you run the risk of going off model because since the curve style doesn't have a bone that is rigid, you could make this leg very easily shorter or longer than it should be. So it's just one of those things that you have to be careful of. And I can go back and modify this chest, bring it down a little bit, rotate it out a little bit. So now if I take a look at that movement with the curve style deformer, looks pretty good with the curve style as well. So you can do it either with a bone style deformer or with a curve style deformer. Just tried both of them there. And you see that when I swap out from one rig to the other rig, it swaps on the drawing itself, and I'll show you how I create that. But because you're swapping on the drawing, it swaps at the frame where you swap the drawing. So it still interpolates nicely even when I swap from one to the other. Like if I turn off my deform and I show you the animation on this, you can't really tell when that rig is swapping, apart from the fact that if you look closely, you can tell when it's a bone and when it's a curve style, because it's a little bit bendy on the curve style. But apart from that, you really can't tell when that rig is swapping out. So now you might think, okay, that looks cool. I like the idea of doing that. I want to try that myself. How do I do it? So what I always do when I'm doing the deform rigging is I like to just always set up the hierarchy the way I would set it up without any deforms in it first. And you might end up getting an extra peg somewhere. Like in this case, I have an extra peg on the leg, and that's okay. I can just go, and remove it afterwards if I don't need it, and just get rid of it. But generally, the way that I have things set up here, I have the hips. So I have the hips layer as a drawing layer, and I have a hips peg that allows me to rotate the hips all by itself without affecting the legs, because it's important to be able to do that. Otherwise, every time you move the hips, it's going to move the legs too, and you don't want that. And then I have another hips peg that is the parent of the hips as well as the legs and the feet, so that when I need to, I can move these together as a whole group. And then I have the hips, instead of having the hips parented to the chest, I have the hips and the chest as two independent elements, and I have them both connected to the master peg. This wouldn't work very well when you're using the IK tool, because the IK tool wants everything to go sequentially down. But in fact, I kind of like the way that this works when they're separate. It's easier to animate, in my opinion. And it's just a personal preference, but I find that with the deform tool, you don't really need to have IK because of the fact that you can stick the feet in a different way. And in fact, I find it easier to animate using FK with the different swapped out rigs than I do using the IK without deform. But, as I said, it's a personal preference. It's what you're used to and what you can play around with. So then what I'll do is when I'm ready to set the rig, I'll do the rig on this back leg. First, I'll just select the leg. You can select it with your transform tool, or you can click on the node in your network. Just make sure that you have the leg itself selected, the TVG layer, not the peg layer. And then we can go into our deform tool, our rigging tool. So I'll select the rigging tool and I'll go into setup mode. And first, I'll set up my top-down rig. And I always set up the top-down rig first because if I set the top-down rig first on this leg, I also want to set it first on this leg so that when I go back to animate it later, I always know my top-down rig is first, and then my second rig is going to be the bottom-up rig. It's just easier to be consistent that way. So then I can just click, click, click to create my bone-style deformer on this. And now I've got a deformer on the first leg. So I can double-check it by leaving setup mode and taking my transform tool, and I can see that this is rotating pretty well here. Now the foot isn't coming along with it, so there is a step after you do that that will allow you to move the foot with it. So this is where I got my extra peg layer here. But first what I'll do is I'll just connect the foot into here. You can theoretically connect the foot directly into that deform, but it's not a good idea to do that because of the fact that when you have something connected directly to the base of that, the foot will not only move with the deform of the leg, it will also deform with the leg. And you kind of want the foot's position to follow the position of the deformed leg, but you don't want the foot itself to deform as well. So to avoid that, what we have is we have the ability to select our deform here, and then we can create a kinematic output. And what this does is it creates a second port. I'll just mouse over that again so you can see where that is, create kinematic output. And it creates a second port now, and we can just connect that port down to the foot. So now you can see that I've got an extra peg layer here that I don't need, so I can just hold down Alt, slide it out, hit delete to remove it. So now what I have is I have a deform on this leg layer. So first I get the first deform set up the way that I like it, and I go back and I double check and I make sure it's going to work just fine. And once I have the first one working, then what I can do is I can select my leg layer again. I'll just move over to the second frame to do it on the second frame, but you can do it again on the first frame. It doesn't really matter what frame you're on. But I just moved over to the second frame. I'll select the same leg layer as before, and then I'll duplicate the drawing. And what happens when you duplicate the drawing is that it's going to create a new rig. By default, and this is one of those things that's set up in your preferences. Let's just see here if we can figure out deformation. So in the deformation tab of your preferences, by default, it has this option checked on create pose deformer. And what a pose deformer means is it's every time you swap or create a new drawing, it will allow you to create, or it will create automatically a new rig for that. So in other words, I'll show you here. When I select the leg layer and I duplicate the drawing, watch the rig. I duplicate the drawing and the rig disappears. The rig disappears because I've created a new drawing, and so therefore it's setting me up to create a new rig. So all I have to do to actually create the new rig is go into my rigging tool, go into setup mode. And now I can start creating this rig, and I'm going to create it from the bottom up this time. So I can click down here, I'll click again in the center, and then I'll click at the top. And so I can double check this rig, I'll leave setup mode, I'll turn on my transform tool, and now instead of moving the bottom of the rig, I'm just going to move the top of the rig here. So I can set this guy up, and then maybe I want to go up here and animate this hip up again, and just see how that works. Whoa, cool. Okay, so I've got my top down rig, I've got my bottom up rig. Just for fun, I'll just show you how we can do also a curve. So I'll select the leg and I'll duplicate the drawing again, go back into rigging tool setup mode. If you want to do a curve instead, you can just drag up and then drag back down and go to the transform tool, turn off rigging setup mode, and now you can play around with animating that from the bottom up. So the curve style seems a bit easier to animate, but it's just that you have that possibility of going off model with it. If you have really bendy legs, of course the curve is the way to go. But if you don't have bendy legs, then it's probably a better idea to go with the bone just to keep it a bit more rigid and on model. So that's it. Now as you're animating, at any point in time, I've done a few frames of animation on this guy, kind of just wiggling his hips around, but at any point in time, I can, let's say I've got these two solidified here. He's rotating his hips and then he's solidified down here, and I want to kick the leg out. So on the next frame over, what I'll do is I'll select the drawing. I'm selecting the actual TVG here, and I can swap the drawing back to the top down rig, and then I can rotate the top down rig now from the top again. So I'll just select that, rotate it out, and now he's kicking his leg out. So actually I put those two right next to each other, so I might just want to, I think what I would want to do here is I probably first want to swap the rig out. Let me think about how the best way is to do this. You might want to swap the rig out and do a slight movement on it where it's kind of in the same position, but but a little bit different. And now this is a very good way of you seeing how I've gone off model already. I've gone off model with that curve style deformer, because when I had the curve style, I kind of made his leg longer, which doesn't match up very well with the actual leg. So I'll just make this curve deformer match a little bit better what's going on there. So I can swap out the rig here, and then I can go, let's just create a keyframe on everything with F6. I'll go a few frames later, and now I can kick the leg out, and maybe I even want to give a little bit of little hyperextension there on the leg as he kicks it out. So, poof. So at any point in time you can switch, and this is the stuff that I did before. That doesn't work, but ignore the stuff that I did before. And so then when we look out here at the good stuff where the feet are planted, you can switch from the planted to the top-down rig at any point in time. So hopefully that gives you guys a few ideas of what you can do. This is just something I think that you should play around with. So just start out by creating the different rigs on your legs. You don't really need this type of rig on the arms. You can get away with having only one rig on the arms, but it's really on the legs where you need to have two. You don't need to have three, you just need to have two, but you can decide whether you want to do bone style or curve style. And so create the two different, create the top down and create the bottom up, and then play around with swapping them out and animating with them, and see if that in any way helps with the animation when you want to stick the feet. I definitely think it does, but it's just my personal opinion.